Senator from Kansas.
Mr. President, over the last few weeks, I've been back home, and many people were finishing up wheat harvest. Absolutely one of the joys of the entire year when a year's work of hard work comes to fruition. And every corner of the state was speckled with combines, tractors, grain carts, and trucks, all doing their part in the harvest process. Inside those implements were fathers and sons, sisters, mothers, brothers, and my cousins, all working side by side to harvest the crop that will provide the financing for land payments, equipment loans, operating loans, and next year's inputs like seed and fertilizer. Now, agriculture is a capital-intensive industry, much more than I could have ever imagined. Harvesting wheat requires at least 4 different pieces of machinery, many costing $250,000, $500,000 or more each. It takes years for a farmer to build enough equity to purchase a new piece of equipment or land, and for many families, it's only by passing down the land and equipment that a family farm can remain viable. This is the only way a young farmer can truly survive. Now, the common saying in Kansas is that farmers live poor but die rich. Now, across this great nation, contrary to most people's beliefs, 98% of farms and ranches are family-owned. 98% family-owned. Those families produce much of the food, fuel, and fiber we consume here in the United States and around the globe. These family farms, many in their 4th, like mine, 5th generation, and even 6th and 7th generation farms and ranches are out there now. They endure turbulent weather, inconsistent market conditions, and tight labor markets. It seemed like growing up a week never passed that my dad never looked at me and said, you know, farming has to be the biggest gamble there is in America. In 2017, Republican-led government passed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which provided sweeping tax changes to encourage private entrepreneurship and economic growth. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the exemptions for the estate tax, as we call it, the death tax, more than doubled, keeping most family farms safe from redundant government taxation. But now the current administration and some of my friends across the aisle want to task hardworking agriculture producers with the financing of the roughly $5 trillion reckless tax and spending bill. I think President Eisenhower, or Ike as we call him, a fellow Kansan, hit the nail on the head when he said, and I quote, "You know, farming looks mighty easy when your plow is a pencil and you're 1,000 miles from the cornfield," end quotes. First, they proposed not only eliminating stepped-up bases on realized property, but also on unrealized assets at the time of the owner's death. Their proposal would tax unrealized capital gains over $1 million at ordinary income tax rates, which would be levied at the top marginal rate at 39.6%. That means the next generation inheriting land and equipment would have to pay taxes on the increase in value, even if the property is never sold. Secondly, the administration's proposed lowering the exemption to the death tax from $11.7 million under the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act to $3.5 million per person, and increasing the top tax rate from 40% to 45%. Consequently, a family farm commonly would have to sell off 1/3 of their land to keep going from generation to generation. And the buyers, unfortunately, will be large corporations or foreign entities. According to a report published by Texas A&M's Agriculture, Food, and Policy Center, under current law, only 2 of their 94 representative farms would be impacted by an event triggering a generational transfer of property. 2 out of 94. To contrast this, up to 98% of their representative farms would see how higher tax burdens if certain parts of the administration's plan were enacted. From 1997 to 2020 in Kansas, cropland values raised 220%. In some parts of the United States, they've increased over 500%. If there was a 20% capital gains tax on those valuation increases, the average Kansas farmer would have to have a new tax obligation of nearly $250,000. These numbers are simply unbearable. You know, I stop and pay homage to my grandfather and both of my grandfathers who had 4th, 5th generation family farms. These farms were bought in the early 1900s. Both farms have been in the family over 100 years. I would suppose my grandfathers paid less than $100 per acre. Today, those farms, maybe they're worth $1,000, $2,000 an acre. But if you could imagine the tax burden of trying to pass down that farm and pay for that stepped up basis, for the tax on the increase in that property, it simply isn't going to happen. None of us have brothers and sisters and cousins that have that type of cash available. We want to encourage the next generation to return home to the family farm, not tax them into bankruptcy. America will see millions of acres of lands and billions of dollars of equipment change hands over this next decade. While the current administration contests that only a small percentage of our farm families will be impacted by their proposed changes, all evidence really indicates otherwise. The administration fails to consider the several realities of multi-generational farms, with some siblings staying on the farm and some selling their interest. Any changes to the estate tax and opportunity to pass assets from one generation to the next will lead to further consolidation in the ag industry. Fewer young families returning home to their rural communities, and more rural Main Street businesses closing shop. We can't allow this administration to saddle our hardworking farming families with the responsibilities of funding their socialist agenda. Agriculture is still responsible for 40% of the Kansas economy. We must all do what we can to ensure our family farms have every opportunity possible to continue their way of life and bring the next generation back to the farm and keep rural America alive and well. Thank you, Mr. President, and I yield back.